Before we look at Nehemiah chapter 5 tonight from the room that you're accustomed to seeing me teach from, I wanted to say hello from Louisville, Kentucky, where I'm spending the week. I'm on the campus of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary here, and this is a special place. Some of you recognize it from having been here on our spring break trip a year and a half ago. I hope that in a year or so we can come back and some of you would have a chance to visit it as well. One of the most special places in the world to me. It reminds me of the goodness of God in my life. When my wife Julie and I came here and with our two kids, and we felt like God was calling us to work with college students. We didn't know what that would look like, and we didn't know what shape that would take. We didn't know where that would be. But to come back here now and think back to those days and see how God has worked in our lives and the people that He has allowed us to interact with, like you, has been just such a great blessing for us. And so it's always a great time to be here. It's great to be here in October. Kentucky has what they call seasons. I don't know if you're from Florida, you're probably not familiar with seasons other than tourist season and hurricane season, and that's maybe about it. But they have what they call fall here, and the leaves are changing, and it is gorgeous. And I wish you all could be here and we could go eat some barbecue and enjoy the changing of the leaves, because it is just a perfect time to be here weather-wise, and a great time to be here and just have at least a week of fall before we go back to the heat of Florida. So I'm glad to be here. I'm glad you're there. Not that I don't wish you were here. I'm just glad I'm not there and that I'm here. And tonight you're going to look in Nehemiah chapter 5. And as you do that, you're going to see how Nehemiah loves his neighbor. If you were to talk to professors on this campus, they would tell you that in spite of all the books in those libraries and in spite of all the classes that are being taught around this campus, that you would never want to lose sight of the two great commandments that Jesus gave us: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and body, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And so as you think about those things, you're going to see in Nehemiah's life tonight an example of that, of how he loves his neighbor, because it was not convenient. He was busy. He had big projects. He was working on good things, and yet he was called away from those things to take care of his fellow brothers and sisters. And it's a good lesson and a good reminder for us. I look forward to being back with you next week. And in the meantime, I hope that you have a great time and that I have a safe trip back home, and we'll see you soon. Welcome to week 8 of BCM. We're in Nehemiah chapter 5. And tonight we're going to see our story take a little bit of an unexpected turn, because so far we've seen Nehemiah meet some resistance, some opposition, but that has always come from the outside. It has not come from inside. And tonight we're going to see that there is opposition on the inside, that there is turmoil and upheaval, and things are not always going wrong. Don't you find that to be the case, that sometimes in your life you think, man, things are just really going well in this area, and then suddenly it seems like they fall apart in a different area, or things crop up, problems and obstacles crop up for us in unexpected places and unexpected ways sometimes. And so that's what we're going to see in the story of Nehemiah, because they have faced the opposition from the outside. He's called the people together. He's rallied them. He's got them to a place where they're working, and they are past now halfway through, which we talked about last week was a difficult place to be, difficult place for us to be sometimes, and we want to move on to the next thing. Well, Nehemiah and his people find out that the next thing brings for them even more challenges, and these challenges come from within, so that in the middle of restoration and resurgence and all the good things that are happening with the people pulling together and rallying together around this common cause of restoring the glory of the city, and thereby reflecting the glory of God in the success of the city and the defense of the city and in the maintaining of the city. Now we're going to see that there is certainly trouble on the horizon, and it comes not from outside but from within. And so we see in chapter 5 that two things are happening. The wealthy people of the land are exacting interest from their poor brothers and sisters. In other words, they're charging them interest on money that they're having to lend to them, on money that they are lending to them. And so that was a violation of what Moses had written to them in the law, that they were not to charge their brothers and sisters interest on money that was borrowed to meet the necessities of life. That if they were meeting the necessities of life and they were in difficult circumstances, that you were just to loan them money, and certainly that money would be repaid, but not with interest. And so the wealthy people had really started a business, basically, of exacting interest from the people. And so they were facing this economic crisis because the wealthy were doing something that went against the law of God and the law of the people. And so there is trouble because of that. And then also they are selling their poor brothers and sisters into slavery. So when their debts could not be repaid, the poor people were being forced to sell their sons and daughters into slavery. And so you can see why they would rise up against each other, the poor against the rich, the injustice of the country. And certainly we know a little bit about those conversations, more than we did probably this time just a few months ago. And so as we think about that, we see that God's place in this, or God's word in this, has a place for us and something to speak to us and something to teach us about those conversations and about those actions that need to take place in circumstances in which we see injustice happening. And so for the people, they were charging interest, and they were selling their sons and daughters and their fellow countrymen into slavery to repay the debts. And so let's look at what Nehemiah says, beginning in verse 1 of chapter 5. So chapter 5 begins by saying, "Now there arose a great outcry of the people and of their wives against their Jewish brothers. For there were those who said, 'With our sons and our daughters we are many, so let us get grain that we may eat and keep alive.' There were also those who said, 'We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our houses to get grain because of the famine.' And there were those who said, 'We have borrowed money for the king's tax on our fields and our vineyards. Now our flesh is as the flesh of our brothers, our children are as their children. Yet we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but it is not in our power to help it, for other men have our fields and our vineyards." And so those first 5 verses, outline the problem, the issue, what's at hand. There's this crisis within the country that the people have risen up and said, this is not right, this is wrong. Nehemiah hears about this, knows about this. There are all kinds of injustices happening in the society and in their community. And so Nehemiah says in verse 6, "I was very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. I took counsel with myself, and I brought charges against the nobles and the officials. I said to them, 'You are exacting interest, each from his brother.' And I held a great assembly against them and said to them, 'We, as far as we are able, have bought back our Jewish brothers who have been sold to the nations. But you even sell your brothers that they may be sold to us.' They were silent and could not find a word to say. So I said, 'The thing that you are doing is not good. Ought you not to walk in the fear of our God to prevent the taunts of the nations, our enemies? Moreover, I and my brothers and my servants are lending them money and grain. Let us abandon this exacting of interest. Return to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive orchards, and their houses, and the percentage of money, grain, wine, and oil that you have been exacting from them." So Nehemiah has a response, and his first response is a response of anger. He is righteously angry at what is going on. Paul says, "Be angry and sin not." So we know that there is a place, there is a way for us to be angry in our spirit and not sin. We see examples in the New Testament of Jesus being angry. He cast the money changers out of the temple. It said at times that he was angry with the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, because of their attitudes, because of the way that they were treating people. And so when Nehemiah hears about this, he's angry. But then it has an interesting verse in verse 7, an interesting phrase that I think is really good and helpful for us. "I took counsel with myself, and I brought charges against the nobles and the officials." Before he confronts the people, it says he takes counsel with himself. Now, how do you take counsel with yourself? This is giving yourself a pep talk. This is telling yourself that you're not going to react in a way that would be sinful, that would be out of bounds that would be inappropriate. And so what Nehemiah does, he takes counsel with himself. This is writing the email and then pausing before you hit send. This is typing up a long social media message that you just can't wait to just blister somebody about something that they've done or said or thought or commented about themselves. And then before you hit send, taking counsel with yourself. Nehemiah offers us some instructive words here when it says that he took counsel with himself. We would probably all be a little better off if we took counsel with ourselves a little bit more often and said, is this the right response in this situation, especially in situations in which our emotions are inflamed. And it says he was very angry, and so he knows that before he says something that he will regret, he needs to take counsel with himself. And so maybe he slept on it. Maybe he just kind of thought, I probably don't need to say that. I probably need to say it this way instead. He takes counsel with himself, and then he responds to the people, and he just confronts them and said, hey, here's what's going on. We've gone to great lengths to get out of slavery with other nations all the way back in our history. We didn't do that so that we could enslave ourselves to one another. So let's stop this, and let's stop the exacting of interest that we know is wrong because of the law of the land and the law that God has given us and passed down through Moses. We know that this is not right. So let's stop doing it. And so he confronts those people, even in his anger. He confronts them after taking counsel with himself, and he says, here's what's happening, and here's what needs to happen. Here's what's happening. Here's what needs to happen. Here's what needs to happen. We're doing all these things, and he says, but return to them their fields and their vineyards and their olive orchards. Let's make this right. It's never too late to do the right thing. And so he tells them, yes, this is what you've done. It's wrong. It doesn't need to be this way. We need to do the right thing. Let's do it today. The best time to do the right thing is right now. Then they said, we will restore these and require nothing from them. We will do as you say. And so he calls the priest. He makes them swear to do what they had promised. Then, in a very traditional cultural thing, he says in verse 13, I also shook out the fold of my garment and said, so may God shake out every man from his house and from his labor who does not keep this promise. So may he be shaken out and emptied. And all the assembly said, Amen, and praised the Lord. And the people did as they had promised. Because of Nehemiah's, again, initiative, a word we've talked about multiple times over the course of the semester, because of his initiative in doing something, in taking action, in not just saying, this would be a good thing to do, let's just talk about this, let's form some groups and some committees. He said, we're going to take action. This is the wrong thing to do. He calls them out. He calls them on what they're doing, and he says things need to be different. And so they promise, they recognize he's right. They don't have a case. There's no way that they can justify what they are doing. And so after he calls them out, they say, we'll do the right thing. We'll do what we promised. And he says, well, you better, because I'm going to pray that you will be shaken out and emptied like the folds of my garment if you don't do what you've promised to do. And so then Nehemiah goes on in verse 14, and he tells us this. He says, moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king, 12 years, he does the math for us, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. The former governors who were before me laid heavy burdens on the people and took from them for their daily ration 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants lorded it over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. I also persevered in the work on this wall, and we acquired no land, and all my servants were gathered there for the work. Moreover, there were at my table 150 men, Jews and officials, besides those who came to us from the nations that were around us. Now what was prepared at my expense for each day was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep and birds, and every 10 days all kinds of wine in abundance. Yet for all this I did not demand the food allowance of the governor, because the service was too heavy on this people. Remember for my good, O my God, all that I have done for this people. Nehemiah records his own generosity. You don't get the sense that he's doing this in a bragging way, in a sense of calling attention to himself, even in a sense of pride, but rather that he's just recording. Here's what happened. I had the right as the governor of these people for 12 years to take all of this food, an ox a day. That's a lot of ox. That's a lot of oxen, right? 6 sheep? 6 sheep and birds. Multiply that by 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And that's a lot of food that he was rightfully able to claim. But he says, I didn't claim those things because the burdens were heavy on my people. And so as we read this and as we think about this, 2 real thoughts, 2 real statements that come to mind about this that will help us think about what he did in this situation and what we should do in similar situations when we see injustice. One is this: how we treat others reflects what we think about God. How we treat others reflects what we think about God. All that Nehemiah has said to God in his prayers, in his actions over the course of the first 4 chapters, comes out in chapter 5 in the way he treats people who really can do nothing for him. That he did have the right to rule over him, to lord it over him, as he said, to lord it over them, as he says about the former governors and their underlings and their servants. So he says to them that they had the right to do this. And so even though he had that right, he gave up that right. Why? Because how he treated others was reflected by what he thought about God. And so he says, this is not right, and I'm going to obey the laws of God rather than the customs of the culture. I'll obey the laws of God rather than the customs of the culture. And so in doing that, he reflects what he thinks about God, how we think about the least and the lowly and the poor and those who need help and those who are being victims of whether it be crimes or just injustice. How we treat those people reflects what we think about God. And then secondly, how we treat others reflects what we think of ourselves. How we treat others reflects what we think of ourselves. Because for Nehemiah, had he had the attitude that I am better than these people, I am above these people, they do owe me a certain measure of perks and accolades, and I deserve all of this food, and I deserve everything that's coming to me because I've reached this level and I've worked this hard, and so these are the just desserts of my hard work and my willingness to put myself in a position where I can prosper. But instead, he's going to treat these other people, and that reflects what he thinks of himself. He sees himself as a servant of the Most High God. So for us, what we think about God determines how we're going to treat other people. And then how we're going to treat those people also reflects what we think of ourselves. That if we think of ourselves in terms that show that we are prideful or egotistical or selfish, self-centered, then that's going to be reflected in how we treat others. And so the fact that Nehemiah could turn and put the well-being of others shows that even though in a sense he was giving something up, he was giving something up in the sense that he was giving up some of his privilege and status and some of the things that he could have done. But in another very real sense, he was only giving that up because he sought something that was better. When we give up the things of the world, because we're seeking after something better, that we're seeking after God, that's not really giving anything up, because he's looking for better, and he considered better to be taking care of his people and showing them grace and showing them mercy and showing them love. And so even in this passage, as we've talked about in previous passages, Nehemiah is a type of Christ. He reflects some of the things that we see come to completion in the person of Jesus Christ when he comes to earth, because Nehemiah is standing up for a poor and powerless people. And as the ruler, he has the right to enjoy the things that are rightfully his. But instead, he sets aside some of those privileges, just the same way that Jesus has set aside some of the privilege of sitting at the right hand of the Father to come down to be among us, to tabernacle, as it says in the book of John, to be with us, to dwell with us, and then ultimately to dwell within us, that he considered that to be better than the privileges that he had enjoyed before, that he considered that to be worth dying on the cross so that we could have a relationship with him, that he considered that to be a part of what he was called to do, that his work was to do the will of his Father. And so that was the better thing that he sought. For Nehemiah, the better thing that he sought was the welfare of the people, because he knew that God would bless that, and that the good that he was doing for the people was better than enjoying the privileges of the world and all that it offered. So for us, as we think about that, and as we close out our time together with those two statements on our mind, that how we treat others reflects what we think about God, and how we treat others reflects what we think of ourselves, then we go into the next week and semester and the next year and the rest of our lives with those thoughts, knowing that there's always the spiritual dimension in our lives of the vertical between us and God, and how that impacts our behavior and our beliefs and everything else, that what we think about God. But also what we think about God reflects what we think about ourselves, and how we treat others reflects what we think of ourselves, that we put ourselves at his feet and at his servant, and we see ourselves as servants, as sons and daughters of the King, and we are free to live out his will and his calling on our life as a result of what he has done for us. I hope you have a great time of discussion in the next few moments, and that you will carry this passage and think about the things that we've talked about in the book of Nehemiah, and particularly tonight as we look at Nehemiah chapter 5. I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next week.